This channel is Mototherapy, and it's dedicated to the therapeutic benefits of riding motorcycles. I recently took up motorcycle riding. Well, it's been about 8 months. I had retired from my job. Well, I had been in the Army for 30 years, and I had retired, and I had always wanted to learn how to ride a motorcycle, and I had never learned, and I realized I wasn't getting any younger. And if I was ever going to learn how to ride a motorcycle, I needed to do it soon. And I thought I would just learn how to ride a motorcycle and gradually master the skill of riding. And that would be sort of the end of it. And I would have the satisfaction of knowing that I had learned how to ride a motorcycle. What I didn't expect was the dramatic stress reduction and almost sense of fulfillment that I experienced after riding a motorcycle after some of my rides. And initially I thought, well, maybe it's just the sense that I survived and I didn't crash and I'm here in one piece, and maybe this will just subside. But if anything, the more I rode and sort of the longer rides I had, the stronger the effect seemed to be. And it seemed to be independent of any kind of fear because I was getting better and better at riding and more comfortable on my bike. And yet this sense of stress relief and stress reduction was increasing, if anything. And I decided, well, I need to look into this more because there's obviously more going on here than I expected. And that led me to start looking at different research that's out there and try to understand what is going on. The very first thing I came across was a UCLA study conducted in 2021 on the mental health benefits of motorcycle riding. Now, the study was funded by Harley-Davidson, and you could say, well, Harley-Davidson obviously has some obvious benefits from funding such a study because they sell a lot of motorcycles. And I think that's a true assessment. I mean, in the same way that pharmaceutical companies pay universities to research their drugs, Harley-Davidson was paying UCLA to research motorcycle riding. But given all of that, I think it's fair to say UCLA doesn't work for Harley-Davidson. And they conducted an independent study, and they noticed that a lot of biomarkers of stress were actually reduced by as little as a 20-minute motorcycle ride, which motorcyclists have been saying this all along. Anecdotally, you'll hear this all the time, that there's a lot of stress reduction in riding a motorcycle. And you'll notice afterwards you just feel much better. Well, the study found that the participants experienced a 28% decrease in cortisol levels, which is a blood lab. So it's not just like a self-report of someone saying, hey, I feel so much better after riding, which is obviously very common, but there's no real way you can trick a blood lab. And what they were seeing is, wow, there's really something to this. Something is going on. And they suggested that it creates a heightened sense of awareness. And I think that's true. When you're riding a motorcycle, you're trying to, balance yourself, and you're trying to stay upright, and you're trying not to hit anything, especially cars. And you tend to be very alert. And it does give you a heightened sense of awareness. And that may be one of the factors that leads to a sense of stress reduction. So it's an interesting study, and it's an interesting finding that this research came up with. The next thing that I looked into was some of the research by a doctor named Dr. Shane O'Mara, and he's a neuroscientist and professor of experimental brain research at Trinity College in Dublin. And he has done a lot of research on the neurologic benefits of walking. And he talks about the benefits of optic flow while you're walking through space and you're seeing objects, and that our brains may actually dramatically benefit from walking. I think it's an interesting line of research, and I believe he's right. I think this is true information. If you extrapolate out what happens if you accelerate that process. So obviously the optic flow effect, which sort of he talks about sort of down regulates the amygdala, which is associated with stress. So it's sort of suppressing amygdala activation, but seems to benefit hippocampal development. If that's occurring during walking, well, what if you go faster? And I started thinking about, well, you're sort of turbocharging your optic flow on a motorcycle, and everything's going by you much faster. And for some reason, that tends to sort of lock you into this high state of focus. And at the same time, you start to feel very relaxed. It's an interesting effect. I started to think about in my life, well, why doesn't this occur in a car? And I think it's because in a car you're in sort of this bubble or cocoon, and you're not really as connected with your environment the way you are on a motorcycle. And I sort of went through and realized, I have several mountain bicycles, and when I go relatively fast down like a trail on a mountain bike, this effect starts to occur, but it's in a much milder version. And I kind of went through times in my life where I noticed this effect. Another example would be downhill skiing, and particularly downhill skiing on trails. There's something about having objects whizzing by you that you're trying not to hit that seems to really create this optic flow process where you feel much more relaxed afterwards. And so I was examining that as well and going, there's something going on here. I think Shane Amara's research is really relevant, but we may need to go beyond that, because it does feel like I'm almost turbocharging my optic flow on a motorcycle. And the only other example I could think of is riding a horse fast, like at a gallop through like a narrow road or trail. And I'm not a big horseback rider, but I have ridden a horse at a gallop before, and it does start to approach this. So there are other times when this optic flow process seems to really reduce stress and result in like relaxation. And it seems to have somewhat to do with speed, but there are other conditions where the speed doesn't seem to matter. And I would think about, well, I have ridden plenty of roller coasters, and while you might be very afraid on a roller coaster, there's sort of a thrill versus fear, kind of overcoming your fear process. It just doesn't seem to be the same as riding a motorcycle. And then another example is I was on what we call jump status, but it's essentially parachute status or static line parachute status for years in the Army. And jumping out of an aircraft and then having your parachute open, it certainly challenges you to sort of overcome anxiety and fear, but it doesn't seem to evoke the same optic flow state. Now, it might be because the parachute jumps we do in the military are really quick. It might just be over so quickly that it doesn't really have a chance to occur. And I don't know, maybe people who do a lot of free fall parachuting, maybe they do have this effect. But I started to think about, it certainly occurs a little bit while you're walking, but it's much more dramatic when you're going fast. And there's something about speed and looking at objects coming up and trying to avoid them that seems to be very, very helpful.